Go ahead and create a new file for this. I'll just say test. Save it. Put .py and make a Python file. And in this one, I want to get some input from the user. I want to print it out. So basically, whatever they give me, I want to echo it back to them. So to do that, I'm going to go ahead and put my print statement in here. But we're going to need to know two more things to complete this. We're going to need to first be able to get input from the user. We're going to use this function here, input, followed by open close parentheses. And this is going to pause the functioning of our code, wait for the user to type out a message, and press enter. Once the user presses enter, it takes that message and puts it right here where the input function is. Now, this program here, if I go ahead and run this, I'll jump over to my command prompt, do Python test. I go and run this, the input paused. It has a cursor here. It's waiting for us to give it input. So I'll just type hello and press enter. And you see that nothing happens. So this input blocked the code from running. Got it? Then nothing happened. Well, the reason why is because we didn't do anything with that input. So we need to actually store this input into a variable. A variable can be thought of as like a box or a storage container. You're putting something on the shelf while your code's running, and you're going to use it for something later. The way that we do variables in Python is we just give it a name and we use an equal sign. So I'm going to call this user input. I'm going to set it equal to input, the input function. And this line of code here, what this is saying is create a variable called user input. Now the equal sign is saying take whatever's on the right hand side and store it into whatever's on the left hand side. So this line of code says, hey, I have this variable called user input, and I have this thing on the right side of this equal sign happening. I don't know what it's doing there. It's doing something, but it gives me whatever that is, and I'm going to store it into the left hand side. And this last part of the line, this input is saying, hey, stop the code from running. User, type something in and press enter, and I'll put it right here where I'm at. And so input happens first. It grabs the user input, sets it there. Equal sign says, hey, there's something here. I'm going to store this into whatever's over there. And then there's this variable here waiting. It's like, hey, you just gave me something. I'm going to save this. And then now we can use this variable later on and get the value that was stored in it. And so I'm just going to put that inside my print statement. I'm going to say print user input. I'll go ahead and save this, Control S, jump back to my command line, and then I'll run my code again, see what happens. Okay, it's asking for user input. So I'll go ahead and say hello again, and I'll press enter. And then notice here, it just said hello back. It just echoed it back to me. Jumping back to our code, that's because the input here got the user's input, stored it into this variable called user input. Line 2, nothing happens, it's blank. Line 3 says print user input. So whatever message was left in there, it now gets printed out. Now notice, if we jump back to our hello world code from the previous lesson, we had these quotation marks here. And over here, we do not have those quotation marks. The reason why we have quotation marks here is because this is a literal message we'd like to print out. It's the plain text we're telling it to print out. If I were to come over here and surround this in quotes, it won't treat user input as a variable anymore. It's going to treat it like plain text, as if we want to literally say user input. I'll just show that real quick. So I'll go ahead and clear out my window here so it's a little less chaotic. And now I'll run the code again. Asking for user input, I'll say hello. We'll see what it says back. Now it says user input back. And that's because of these string literal quotes here. And I said this word string. A string is a type of data encoding, and you can just think of that as plain text. It could be anything you see on the keyboard, any of these symbols that you can type in. And that concludes this lesson, but I'd like to issue you a challenge. So we have this input and we're printing something out. Why don't we go ahead and make a new file, and let's make a project out of this. let's make a knock knock joke where we get user input to answer the computer's knock knock joke. And you can make whatever knock knock joke you like. But just to get you started, as an example, I'll create a new file over here. I'll select my language to be Python. The reason it's giving me this new way of creating a file is because I pressed Control N, and that's what happens when you press Control N instead of going to File, New. Okay, so I'll print out the literal message using a string literal. I'll say knock, knock, just like that. And on the next line, I want the user to respond with something. So I'll say user input equals the input function to get input from the user. And hopefully they say who's there. And I'll print out the literal message, Kent, for my joke. Because my knock knock joke is knock knock, who's there, Kent, can't you tell? Or Kent who, and then can't you tell? That's the knock knock joke here I'm doing. So I'll save this as knock knock. I'll jump back over here, run it, and oops, that's the wrong one. I'll do clear. Clear. Do Python knock knock.py. It says knock knock. I'll say who's there. And it says Kent. So the rest of the joke's not completed yet, but you can kind of see where that's going. So for this first activity, first coding project, you are to make a knock knock joke, and that's about it. We'll refine this in later video lectures, but that's it for this lecture. I'll see you in the next one.